What a gospel reading. Very lengthy, with a lot of interpretation that is kind of piled on top of it. And so we're going to start with our psalm instead, Psalm 95. When I think of the opening words of this psalm, I cannot help but think about morning prayer. This is usually the psalm that is used if you look in the hymnal, in the beginning of the hymnal, you'll see this liturgy for morning prayer, and you'll always start with Psalm 95. And I got experience leading and participating in morning prayer when I went to Holden for a J term. And so up in Holden Village, we would do morning prayer, evening prayer, and night prayer every day for 2.5 weeks to talk about how the cycles of the church are connected to the cycles of the earth. And so we would try to gather somewhere around this beautiful mining village that was now belonging to the Lutherans. And so I have this beautiful memory of being on top of a hill in the darkness, beginning the opening words and hearing, "In the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us." And eventually, as we sing this psalm, just looking out and seeing the mountains suddenly appear as the sun rises. And what had been there all along was suddenly revealed. And as the sun continued to rise, then what we had seen first, we began to perceive differently as the sun moved and the colors changed and the shadows lengthened. And so I can't help but bring that vision into our text today. That while it would be very easy to see that this text is about seeing and not seeing, it's clear that it is also about perceiving with all the senses. Because right after this text, Jesus launches into the story of the Good Shepherd, and the sheep are the ones who hear his voice. We can see that the people, while they might be able to see very well, they are not able to perceive. I think it's important to talk about perception this way because people in this reading and often people in our society talk about being blind as not being able to perceive. But those who have been born blind know that those are very different. People who have an experience of being blind are able to perceive with different senses. And so we can change our language a little bit to be able to say this is about perception. This is about what God is revealing to us, and if we are open to receiving that in new ways. I think about there's a bishop in the ELCA, Craig Satterlee. He might not be a bishop anymore. He's in Michigan, but he was born blind. And the way he talks about God being revealed to him is not his sight being restored, but he thinks about God being revealed through ophthalmologists, through his parents, so people who said, "You are blind, but you are able to perceive, and we are able to perceive God's gifts in you," and told him they thought he was maybe called to ministry so that he could continue in that, so that he was able to feel called, and that he himself was seen for his gifts. Because in a way, this miracle is not so much a miracle. We are in the book of John, and in John, there are no miracles. There are only signs. So the Jesus turning water into wine, Jesus feeding the 5,000, they are not called miracles. They are signs that point to something bigger, something more, pointing to Jesus coming into the world, who often says, "I am the one who brings life, life abundant." So here we have a sign that is more than just one man receiving his sight. This is pointing to the hope that the whole community would also be able to perceive what they have not yet perceived. It's so interesting to go back to this section where after the blind man is healed, The people say, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" They don't ask, "Isn't this Jerry?" Do they know his name? It's not used in the entirety of this text. He is only known as the man who used to sit and beg, or the man who was once blind. Even then, even after he has been hopefully restored to his community, where before all he could do was sit and beg, and Jesus brings this sign to help his whole community perceive him as he is, a beloved child of God who could be part of his community. And yet, his community still continues to fail him. His community still says, "Are you this person that used to sit and beg? You're not begging anymore, but we don't know who you are." His parents, even in fear, do not say, "This is our son. We are overjoyed." They are filled with fear for the rest of their community, and they say, "He's on his own." Even the religious leaders of the time, instead of being so excited about this sign being enacted among them of God's power, of people restored, it doesn't quite fit into the narrative that they're hoping to convey, that Jesus is a sinner and they are righteous, and this man doesn't fit, so they drive him out. And so who finds him? Jesus. And so if this one community will not restore him, then he will find another community, because that's what Jesus continues to do, is to gather people and restore them into community. And this is the sign that we can continue to see in our midst, where I have never perceived or seen anyone who had been born blind receiving their sight. But I have seen signs of God's work, God's glory being revealed when people are perceived differently, when people are restored to their community, when those who did not perceive them finally do perceive them, where the things that have been obscuring members of their community are wiped away, when they are sent out into the world to be part of God's work of reconciliation. Last Friday, I was invited to the governor's prayer breakfast in Olympia, which was very exciting. I was also a little nervous because I'd been invited by my state senator, who's not this state senator, but for 31. Anyway, it's Senator Phil Fortunato. Ideologically, he and I do not agree on many things. So when he was excited about it, I was like, oh boy. But he and I do agree that we want good things for the people of Washington, and especially for the people in Auburn, Sumner, Enumclaw, and that area. And so I was like, sure, I will go. We both want to ask God for good things. So here we go. But I was looking at the program, and they had invited a woman who had founded this company called Pallet. And I was like, oh, how typical. They find the one woman who's involved in some sort of construction and bring her, and it's kind of long. We'll see how it goes. And one of the speakers there was from the University of Washington. He was an emerging leader, and he talked about how he had grown up in Kenya and how his father had died when he was very young. And so his family, they didn't have a social safety net, and they lost everything. And so he ended up running around on the streets for a while until one woman came and said, absolutely not. This is not how we should do community. And so she began a program to take kids from that town who were just living on the streets and helping them, feeding them, housing them, clothing them, educating them. And so this young man had grown up in this program, and then he was speaking to us as someone getting a graduate degree at the University of Washington. And what he said is that hope and a community of caring can change people's lives. Where this man had been outside the community, and someone else had perceived him as needing to be part of the community, and so she restored him to his place. Then we heard from this lovely woman who founded Pallet, and I was like, okay, here we go. Well, it turns out that Pallet is a nonprofit that builds tiny houses for people who are unhoused so that they have one stable spot in which to go through treatment or receive services. So they have a concrete address and a warm, dry place to stay. And of course, then I was like, oh, I'm so bad at perceiving right now. I'm being very judgmental. Um, Actually, I thought that after she started her talk with Webster's Dictionary defines grace, which in sermon classes you learn, like, don't start your sermon that way. But she started it that way to mention that grace is so often a noun, but it can also be a verb, as you grace someone with your presence. And so her speech was all about this grace of presence showing up in her work in Pallet, and how so many times she would hire returning offenders, ex-felons, who were trying to be restored to their community, but were often kept out because they were perceived as people who should be continued to be outsiders, people who are bad people who deserve to be punished. And instead, she was able to perceive them as workers, as people trying to be restored, as people deserving of a second chance. And so these two people were explaining about how communities of care and hope can change lives, can renew the world, can be part of God's work of healing and restoration, and more importantly, signs of God's glory being enacted in the world when people are perceived as they truly are, as beloved children of God. God is calling us to notice, to perceive. I think it's so interesting in this gospel that Jesus does not ask this man if he wants to be healed. There's no discussion. He just goes up to him, makes some mud with some spit and rubs it in his eyes and sends him out again. Jesus doesn't always ask because Jesus knows what we need. And so here again, we are asked to perceive differently. We are sent out into the world to work the works of the one who sent us. In Psalm 95, it says, "Oh, that today you would listen to God's voice." I perceive in new ways. I perceive what God is doing in our midst. And I'm excited because this kind of work can change people's lives. Thanks be to God.